My name is John Pfeffer, and I am the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And I head up as well something called the Global Just Transition Initiative, which looks at various Green New Deals and similar initiatives and projects around the world and evaluates them, including their blind spots. Welcome, Katharine. I will put some of that information in the chat so that you have that. This is an event that's actually part of our Regroup initiative, and Regroup stands for Rare Earth Elements Group, a group that focuses on rare earth elements, the supply chain, as well as resistance to rare earth mining around the world. And if you're interested in joining that, please let us know. You can send me a note in chat. This event is looking very specifically at efforts to address corporate conduct, the corporate conduct of mining corporations, when you've run out of options at the national level. So what options exist at the international level? And one of those options, of course, is at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's basically the group of richest countries in the world. And we're very fortunate to have three people here tonight who can address this question and answer your questions about this process of bringing a complaint to the international level. I'm going to introduce all three folks at the beginning, then I'm going to introduce you again when you're about to speak. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight Katharine Booth, who's a researcher and policy advisor at OECD Watch, which is a network of civil society organizations focused on achieving effective remedy for corporate abuses by using the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and the Guidelines non-judicial grievance mechanism, which she will tell you much more about. We have Katharine Coumans as a research coordinator and Asia Pacific program coordinator at MiningWatch Canada. MiningWatch has filed and accompanied 7 cases against Canadian mining companies with the Canadian NCP, that mechanism that I referred to. And Lee Tan is a statistician and a social researcher with decades of health, environmental, and social justice campaigning experiences, ranging from grassroots activism to policy advocacy at the multilateral institutional level. She leads the Aid Watch campaign, Stop Lynas, and she, of course, will tell us much more about that case as well. We're going to start off with Katharine Booth. Thank you, Katharine, for joining us, and I'm going to pass it on to you and turn off my screen as well.
Thanks very much, John. I'm going to be sharing my screen. I'll just do that now. Let me know if there are any problems, but hopefully there aren't. So as John said, I work at OECD Watch, which is a global network of civil society organizations that is hosted by an NGO based in Amsterdam. So I am an Australian, but I currently live in the Netherlands. OECD Watch focuses on the OECD Guidelines and National Contact Points, and that's the thing I'll be explaining today. I'll try to keep my presentation to about 15 minutes. So I won't go into that much detail, but here is a picture of some members of the network at our global gathering in January and February. We have 130 members based in 130 civil society organizations based in 50 countries. So a global network that focuses on corporate accountability and access to remedy by using the OECD guidelines and the grievance mechanism that is attached to the OECD guidelines, which is called the National Contact Point Mechanism, or NCPs for short. So I'll be using that jargon throughout this presentation. So what am I talking about? What are the OECD guidelines? Well, they were updated 21 days ago, I believe. They're now called the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises on Responsible Business Conduct. So the name has been lengthened with the addition of the focus on responsible business conduct. Basically, the OECD guidelines are just recommendations from the 51 OECD adhering governments to companies on responsible business conduct. The first thing to point out at this early stage is that they're recommendations to companies, they're standards, they're not binding, they're not obligatory. Companies are not required to comply with the standards in the OECD guidelines, but they should, and increasingly they should, because responsible business conduct is not new. It's embedded now. So increasingly, companies really should be complying with these standards that the OECD guidelines set out. So a really brief timeline. The guidelines have been around since 1976, and in 2000, they were updated to include NCPs. In 2011, they were aligned with the UNGPs, so there was the addition of a chapter on human rights and also elaboration on due diligence standards, which we're talking about today. And just this month, the standards for companies were strengthened. I'll go into that in more detail, and I hope also in the discussion we'll go into it in more detail as well. What are the OECD guidelines and why are they unique? So I always start with the most interesting part about them is that they're very broad. The geographic scope is very broad. So 51 OECD governments came up with these standards for companies, and all companies that are headquartered in an OECD country or that are operating in an OECD country should comply with the standards in the OECD guidelines. So they're very broad. Technically, it could then encompass every country in the world, depending on where that company is operating. The issues in the guidelines are also very broad. So the chapters have remained the same. I'm not sure about the level of knowledge of the people on this call, but the chapters generally cover human rights, employment, environment, disclosure, competition, very, very broad. But the issues covered in those chapters has been even further expanded in the new update. So I'll go into that a bit more. The business sectors are unlimited. So mining companies are absolutely covered. There have been many cases against mining companies to NCPs, but it goes beyond mining companies. It can be anything. There is no limitation in terms of what companies actually do. Most importantly, also the guidelines recognize supply chain. I've written supply chain here, but it really should say value chain responsibility. And that means that it covers both upstream and downstream due diligence impacts. So not only those that happen on the factory floor, but also in the other direction in relation to sales, for example. Again, one of the most unique features is the NCP mechanism. John described it as the last resort, and indeed, that is not the first time I've heard that. When there are no other options, an NCP may be a good option to file a complaint against the company. It provides a mechanism to file a complaint against the company based on an alleged breach of the OECD guidelines, or the standards in the OECD guidelines. The last reason why this mechanism is unique is that it's hybrid. What does that mean? It's legally binding on OECD states. What does that mean? So it means that NCPs, the OECD states must establish an NCP. They must have an NCP established in their country, and that must be a functioning NCP as well, although many NCPs do not function very well. So the governments have this obligation to establish an NCP, but the companies have only a responsibility. They do not have an obligation to comply with the standards for companies in the guidelines. Companies' compliance with the guidelines is voluntary. So that is why I describe this as a hybrid instrument. So turning to the OECD guidelines updates, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the new standards for companies, or some of the new topics, I should say, for companies, because I can't go into too much detail right now. But OECD Watch is very happy with the updates in terms of climate and environment and just transition. In our opinion, the OECD guidelines are now they were already a leading standard on responsible business conduct, but they've, in terms of these three aspects, have really been updated to provide more responsibilities for companies to meet. So just generally, the Paris Agreement is cited. companies should aim for net zero emissions. They should have transition plans, implement mitigation targets. Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions are referred to, although I should say that Scope 3 is more of a limited extent. Interestingly, carbon credits are described as a last resort because increasingly, as we know, there are more and more problems coming out with carbon credit schemes. In terms of environmental impacts, there's an unlimited range of environmental impacts that a company can have, and that is understood in the guidelines. They say that the list that they state for companies for environmental impacts is not limited, but it's helpful that they actually set out some of the impacts that companies can have in terms of the environment, and that includes biodiversity loss, land degradation, ecosystem harm, deforestation, water, air, and land pollution, and lastly, also for this presentation, just transition is explicitly referred to. That's the energy transition, but also a digital transition. So it refers to the energy transition, but it also talks about pathways for workers in a digital transition. Here we go. Some more interesting updates with a mining focus. The standards for companies have also been strengthened in terms of meaningful stakeholder engagement, marginalization and vulnerability, and human rights defenders. So meaningful stakeholder engagement. Companies should engage in two-way, good faith, responsive to stakeholders' views, engagement. They should have this engagement should be accessible, appropriate, safe, and companies should also remove barriers to engagement. So we already know that this should be a part of a company's due diligence, but the new guidelines, the updated guidelines, really emphasize that this should be a key part of a company's due diligence. In terms of marginalization and vulnerability, the guidelines also pay special attention to marginalized or vulnerable groups at heightened risk of harms. And human rights defenders is an interesting one. It's not explicitly mentioned in the guidelines, and that's because some states prefer not to use that term. They prefer a broader description of people that can be impacted by a company. But we are happy with the general references to harms against people in terms of those people generally being human rights defenders. In terms of preventing and refraining from reprisals against these people, against human rights defenders. Companies should also promote a safe space to raise concerns, and they should also, if there is a reprisal against a complainant or a person associated with a complainant in an NCP case, the NCP itself should do something to address those reprisals. So that's a little outline of some of the key updates. There are many more, but I've just tried to focus on mining related topics now. So I've been talking about NCPs, and I just give a really brief overview because I think I'm leading to going over my time. But so NCPs are required to be established by governments that adhere to the OECD guidelines. So that means that there are over 50 NCPs. They have two functions. The first is to promote the guidelines, and the second is to handle complaints against companies that have allegedly not met the standards in the guidelines. The focus of this presentation is the second, handling complaints and NCP complaint function. It's important to mention again at the outset that in the same vein as the OECD guidelines being voluntary for companies, companies are not required to participate in NCP processes. It's a voluntary process. So even if a complaint is accepted by an NCP, it is still up to the company to whether to participate in good offices, which is a fancy word for essentially mediation. Mediation is non-judicial, and it is not legally required for a company to participate in it, and that is a disadvantage of the NCP system. So the complaints can be filed really by anyone who has an interest in an issue, in an alleged breach of the standards for companies in the guidelines. there are 4 general stages, the first being filing a complaint, the second being the NCP's initial assessment. This is a preliminary assessment based on whether the complaint should proceed. It should be based on really not much substantiation of evidence should be required for a complaint to proceed. So the bar should be low for an NCP to accept a case. Often some NCPs set too high a bar in OECD Watch's opinion, but the updated guidelines make clear that the bar should be low for a complaint to proceed. It just should be essentially substantiated and be material to the OECD guidelines. If an NCP accepts a complaint, an NCP will offer its good offices, which is in most cases mediation. Some NCPs do this internally. They themselves offer mediation or they engage in negotiation, for example. Some NCPs outsource this. They hire in consultation or without consultation with the parties, they hire a mediator. This process can take really 6 to 12 months. So it's not a short process in some cases. The last stage is the final statement and follow-up. So if the parties do resolve the issues in mediation, they will reach an agreement. An agreement is that's the goal that everyone is seeking through mediation. If the parties reach an agreement, then the NCP will essentially provide as much detail as they can legally provide on that agreement, subject to confidentiality. But if the parties don't reach an agreement, the NCP will issue a final statement. The quality and content of the final statement varies between NCPs. Some NCPs will provide minimal information and won't comment on the issues that were raised in the complaint in their final statement. Other NCPs will, in OECD Watch's opinion, exercise their expertise as a body, as a responsible business conduct body with expertise in the OECD guidelines. And some will actually make what we call a determination or a decision of a company's compliance or non-compliance with the guidelines. These determinations are a really strong outcome, an increasingly common and strong outcome that NCPs, some NCPs, I should say, will make in their final statement. And obviously, if a government body, an NCP, makes a determination of non-compliance with the guidelines by a mining company, that can be a really good outcome for a civil society organization that's filed a complaint against that mining company. Follow-up will happen in every case, actually, under the new OECD guidelines. Follow-up is essentially required. So increasingly, we'll be seeing follow-up happening. But basically, the NCP will ensure that the parties have implemented, I should not say ensure, sorry. The NCP will follow up on whether the parties have implemented the agreement and whether the parties have implemented the determinations or recommendations made, because NCPs can also make recommendations to both parties. Usually those recommendations relate to the company's compliance with the guidelines. I cut myself because, as again, NCPs are these non-judicial bodies. They can't require anything. They cannot force anything. In general, that is the case. There are some limited exceptions to that rule, which we might talk about. Katharine Coumans might talk about that in relation to the Canadian NCP in terms of consequences that might happen for bad faith, but I'll leave that for now. So some of the strengths. In general, they're cheaper and faster. Why is that? Because the timeline for an NCP complaint is supposed to be about a year. Most often, it is longer than a year, especially if extensive mediation is involved in the complaint. Some complaints will go for 2 years, let's say. If they go through mediation and the parties are extensively engaging, then they'll go for much longer than 1 year. But in general, compared to some of the lawsuits we're seeing, for example, in France with the due diligence law that have been going on for several years now, NCPs are generally quicker and faster and cheaper. They're less adversarial because they are non-judicial. They use mediation. So we're not talking about judges here. We're not talking about courtrooms. The complainant and the company are face-to-face in a room or via Zoom increasingly, but face-to-face often. And the aim is to reach an agreement. So they're trying to find common ground on the issues raised in the dispute to reach an agreement. NCPs are non-judicial. They aren't bound by any sort of limitation as to compensation only. Essentially, a complainant can seek anything that they would like to seek in the complaint. General, they might want the company to acknowledge the harm that they've caused or make an apology. In many, many complaints, the complainant seeks improved internal due diligence processes, improved human rights policies, for example. In some complaints, complainants will seek compensation or some sort of reparation of harm, whether that's monetary or non-monetary. They also provide a platform for discussion. You can speak directly with the company concerned. And in some cases, if they are less adversarial, as they should be, I guess, they provide a platform for long-term and future engagement between the complainants, between the parties involved, but not just the parties involved. Sometimes other stakeholders may be interested. For example, shareholders might learn about the issues in the complaint, and then that can be used as sort of a platform to discuss the issue with more stakeholders. But limitations, I've already talked about them. They're voluntary. Companies don't have to meet the standards in the guidelines, and nor do they have to participate in NCP processes. The agreements between the parties are not legally enforceable either, although there are some tests as to whether that is happening at the moment. Many complaints are rejected at the initial assessment stage. That is, NCP set too high a bar at the initial assessment stage. And that sort of closes the door to any sort of discussion happening between the parties. There are very, very few agreements that happen. I'm reviewing the cases from last year, 2022, and there was only one agreement reached between a company and a community or NGO complainant. I should say that OECD Watch only represents communities and NGOs, not trade unions. There's a separate representative for trade unions. So agreements are very rare, and remedy is certainly not guaranteed. It is extremely rare. And that, I believe, is the end of my short overview. I'm sorry if I went a bit too long, but John, I give it back to you.
Thank you, Katharine. That was excellent. And you really set the stage nicely for our discussion. I want to remind folks before I introduce Lee Tan that you can put your questions in the Q&A function. I already have several questions myself, but I will restrain myself. I want folks in the audience to be able to put their questions in there first. Once we've finished the three presentations, we'll go to those Q&A. And if you have any observations you want to make, you can put those in the chat. That's enabled for everybody to communicate with everybody. Our next speaker is going to delve a little deeper into a specific case to give us a sense of how this works in practice. Lee Tan, as I said, is a statistician and a social researcher, and she leads the Aid Watch campaign Stop Lynas. I'll put her bio in the chat as well. Lee, welcome, and we look forward to your contribution.
Thank you. Yep. The case that I'm going to talk, is that shared yet?
I can't see it yet.
Yeah, it could be my internet connection. I'm not sure. Okay, wait. Right, you got it? Good. Good. So the case that we are looking at through Aid Watch, I mean, we hope we will get other NGOs on board as well, from Australia and also perhaps, and especially in Malaysia. Now, this is a case of an Australian company that mine rare earth from is Western Australian mine, concentrate the rare earth and then ship, some 6,000 kilometers to Malaysia for processing near the port of Kuantan in Malaysia. And sadly, it happens to be my hometown, which is why I've been involved with this campaign since 2011. That's over 10 years ago. And this is how long the company has been operating. So in Kuantan, it processed the rare earth concentrate into various oxides, chlorides, and carbonates of rare earth. So they're not the final products of rare earth elements yet. But this particular process is highly hazardous, where much chemicals, acids, and waste, are produced. And here it shows how bad it is at the moment. The reddish piles of waste is the radioactive stream of waste. And then the whitish piles of waste is the not radioactive, but it's still contaminated waste. And the whitish waste is actually piled up to about 11-story high. If you look at the size of the crane in the background, you can imagine, the proportion of or the size of the waste pile. And of course, you can see the wastewater ponds, and the waste that's wrapped in black plastic is also radioactive waste. And this is how this company Lynas is managing the waste in Malaysia, because law enforcement for environmental protection is rather limited in Malaysia, partly because technically, they do not have the capacity or the capabilities to actually deal with this rather complex and massive quantity of waste. So essentially, by the end of this year, we will have something like 1.6 million tons, if not more, of the radioactive waste alone. There's several more million tons of the non-radioactive but hazardous waste left in Malaysia. Now, at the beginning of the operating license, Lynas has agreed to have this waste removed from Malaysia. But in between, lots has happened. And, the waste is now going to be just stored in Malaysia in what Lynas claimed to be a permanent waste disposal facility. And right at the moment, and this week particularly, I've been very busy working with the various experts to put forward their statements, their expert opinion on the suitability, or rather the lack of suitability of this particular location for the permanent disposal of this waste, bearing in mind that Malaysia is a wet tropical country where the rainfall in a day can be more than 2 meters in quantity, 2 meters. That's a lot of rain in a day. So, in America and also in Australia, even in semi-desert or semi-arid environment, this radioactive waste dump has been rejected for scientific and technical reason. Yet in Malaysia, in a wet tropical country, close to the sea, in a peat swamp, the proposal has been accepted, and we are appealing against that proposal, of course. So this particular processing plant is built on a carbon-rich peat land. It has peat forests before it got cleared for the plant, and now the waste ponds as well, and also the permanent dump will be by the plant. Yeah, and there are some significant ecosystem around it. And most important of all, this area is fairly highly densely populated by rural fishing communities, and it is the second largest urban center in the state of Pahang. And as you can see here, children are playing at the what do you call that, estuary, where Lynas wastewater is channeled before it meets the South China Sea. And there are still remnants of very large, beautiful peat mangrove. And I have visited the area several times. And these mangroves are very important fishing ground for the local people. And much of the shellfish comes from the mangrove. And of course, the sedimentation, which will have most of the pollutants, will also affect the quality of the seafood or shellfish particularly, which local people still consume. And it is problematic because some of them are not really clear of the impact. And it does not help when Lynas actually claim that its operation is of zero harms. Yeah, so we will eventually file a complaint. Right at the moment, we are still pursuing the legal avenues, both in Malaysia particularly. Currently, there are 2 legal cases. One is challenging the planning law that this approval for the waste dump has not actually gone through the national planning regulation in Malaysia. And then that's another case is a judicial review looking at the kind of process in which the decision to allow Lynas to let the radioactive waste be dumped in Malaysia was made, how it was made. It was improper. And yeah, so the cases, both of the cases are still pending. So in terms of the OECD complaint, obviously the harms was clearly established with the amount of radioactive waste that's being produced, and also the manner in which this waste has been handled in the last 10 years, and also the location of the waste dump, the inappropriate location of the waste dump. And as Katharine earlier mentioned, some of the issues like climate change, environmental impact, just transition, I can see many points that can fit into any of those issues. And in terms of engagement, I haven't written it here, but what I found, what we found in the last 10 years was the problems with the engagement. It was never transparent. Even the EIA document, we have no easy access to it. The public access is through an hour of viewing in one of the offices of the Department of Environment in Malaysia. I mean, we're talking about volumes of documents that are highly technical, and yet, we have no easy access to it. Unlike in Australia, where all the EIAs are published online, and people, can view it for as long as you like. You can download it, you can actually search, you can do all kinds of, much easier analysis of this document. But in Malaysia, that's not the case. And it took the lawyers a lot of effort before we could actually access a soft copy, so that our expert can actually, go through them to put in their opinions or their critique of the proposal. So in terms, so there are many grounds which we can put forward in our complaints in the near future. And our ultimate goal is to revert back to the original license condition where Lynas is required to remove the radioactive waste. In fact, Lynas has signed 2 legal undertakings in Malaysia that it would remove the radioactive waste if there is no suitable site available for the waste in Malaysia. Yeah, we are very concerned that the way the site's been approved has not gone through rigorous scientific and engineering scrutiny. And we have an engineer, a geohydrologist, and a waste specialist on our side to provide their expert opinion and statement. And of course, you know, those opinions will be used when we have exhausted all the legal avenues in Malaysia to contest against the approval for the radioactive waste dump. You know, of course, we will also seek rehabilitation and cleanup effort by the company. I mean, as Katharine pointed out, the NCP process is not, it's not legally binding and particularly voluntary for the company. And we know that for a company like Lynas, it would be very difficult to get them to come on board. You know, let alone agreeing to demand, but we have to do it just to raise the issues in the international arena because Lynas depends on good reputation to sell its rare earth since it has claimed to be a green, sustainable company that supply rare earth as an alternative to China and that it is a very important major supplier of rare earth to the rest of the world. So we are hoping that, you know, the reputational implication can compel the company to actually come to the table for mediation and also to remediate the problems and the pollution that it has caused in Malaysia. Another issues that we want to raise in the complaint is the justification under international principle for radioactive waste. You know, there must be a justification of benefit for the radioactive waste to be stored in a particular location. Now, in the case of Lynas, there is really no justification because Malaysia has already generously provided a 12-year tax break. So it hasn't been paying any corporate tax since its operation. And also the setup, construction, and the operation itself, and the environmental monitoring and so on and so forth are all very lax as in compared with Australia. And we're very clear of that because Lynas has also set up a plant now in the WA mining town of or city of Kalgoorlie. And I know from going through the documentation and the EIA of the Kalgoorlie plant that the Australian authority are much, much stricter when it comes to managing the waste and also all the waste, particularly the radioactive stream of waste must be removed on site within 24 months to be returned to the mine site in Malwell to be managed as a low-level radioactive waste. Whereas in Malaysia, the waste is classified by Lynas as a very low-level radioactive waste, which means that, you know, it did not require such stringent condition as in Australia. So, you know, we will, of course, you know, the double standard is a problem, and also the health risk to the people in Kalgoorlie and also in Malwell, where the mine is situated. They are both semi-desert landscape with a very, much lower population density than in Malaysia. So, in terms of the just transition, it is completely clear that, this is not a just transition. In fact, Lynas is pushing the emission, the pollution into a developing country with with less political will and also capability to tackle these kind of issues. And of course, we will raise the fact that, it's misclassification of the waste against IAEA guidelines will also be a problem. It is setting a bad precedent, not only just for Malaysia, but also for the world internationally, because this type of waste in Australia has to be isolated for something like at least 1,000 years, and then it needs to be regulated for at least 10,000 years. When we compare with similar type of waste from the uranium industry, where the radioactivity is actually much lower than the one from Lynas. So these are some of the issues that we will delve into, and I really like to hear some feedback, if I can, from Katharine, both Katharines. Because we are, I had experience with NCP complaint when I worked for the Australian Conservation Foundation many years ago. It was a different kind of complaint, and we didn't get very far with that. We're not expecting huge outcome from this one either, but we have no choice but to try it. I think that's about all that I have got. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lee. That was really very helpful dive into a specific case. And I too would be interested in hearing what both Katharines have to say, especially around this issue of name and shame, whether bringing a complaint through the OEC process generates ripples beyond the kind of bureaucratic process itself and challenges the reputation of the mining corporation or corporation in general. I'd like to remind folks that you can put your questions in the Q&A. We have one question there already, and we will get to that question very shortly, but please, others, feel free to put your questions in there. We have one final contribution, and that's from Katharine Coumans, who's the research coordinator and Asia Pacific program coordinator at MiningWatch Canada. And MiningWatch has filed and accompanied 7 cases against Canadian mining companies with the Canadian NCP. So I think, Katharine, you're going to be able to give us a picture of what your engagement with your national NCP has been like. So I pass it on to you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to present on MiningWatch's experience with Canada's NCP. So by way of a bit of background, Canada's NCP was established in 2000, and since then there have been 24 cases brought against Canadian mining companies, so more than one on average per year. And there were 5 cases brought against Canadian mining companies just in 2022. So between 2001 and 2012, MiningWatch Canada brought and supported 7 cases against Canadian mining companies. But after the case we brought in 2012, we'd made a definitive decision not to support any more mining cases through the Canadian NCP, primarily because we had become convinced that bringing a case to the Canadian NCP was very likely to deepen the harm experienced by the complainants. So I will return to this point further on in my conclusions. Although we've not brought any more cases since 2012, we have continued to assess and comment on the NCP. Among others, we've provided briefs recommending reforms in every internal review process of the Canadian NCP where feedback was invited, including the most recent one in 2022. We provided a brief and we played an active role in the peer review process of the NCP in 2018. I'll return to this a bit later on. And in 2021, we supported a substantial submission complaint brought by OECD Watch against the Canadian NCP to the Investment Committee of the OECD. And it's only the second time that such a complaint has been brought against the NCP. And again, I will return to this later on. In summary, we have found that the NCP, the Canadian NCP, among others, is not independent of political interference, does not carry out investigations, does not make findings of fact, although it sometimes appears to in the ways that actually harm notifiers, does not ensure the provision of remedy for those harmed, can offer its good services for its good offices for mediation, but does so very rarely, is protective of corporate reputations, but not those of notifiers, has largely been considered harmful by communities who have attempted to use this office. So over the 23 years of its operations, there have been many missed opportunities for the Canadian NCP to reform itself meaningfully, and I'll mention just a few here. In 2005, there had been 7 cases brought to the NCP. 5 of these 7 cases were against mining companies. 4 of the 5 cases were dismissed by the NCP, so they never were heard, and none resulted in remedy for those who've been harmed. In 2005, the same year, a parliamentary committee reviewed the operations of Canada's NCP in the context of a review of mechanisms in Canada to hold Canadian mining companies to account for harm done overseas. The committee came to the conclusion that there was a need to, and I'm quoting, strengthen the rules and the mandate of the Canadian National Contact Point to enable it to respond to complaints promptly, to undertake proper investigations, and to recommend appropriate measures against companies found to be acting in violation of the OECD guidelines. So the NCP at that time did not do that, and unfortunately it still does not. So the reforms did not take place. In 2016, MiningWatch Canada, OECD Watch, and Above Ground published a report on Canada's NCP, which focused on its handling of the extractive sector cases and concluded, and I'll just read the conclusions, the NCP lacks independence, the NCP is opaque, the process involves unjustified delays, the NCP applies a high threshold for accepting complaints, the NCP does not make findings on whether the companies have breached the guidelines. The government penalty for companies that don't participate has proven to be ineffective in promoting compliance with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The process rarely concludes with an agreement or recommendations, and there is no effective follow-up procedures in place. And in over 15 years at that point of existence, the NCP had consistently failed to provide complainants with effective remedy. In 2018, the NCP was reviewed in a review process by its peers, which are NCPs from other countries, and was also commented on briefly in a country report by the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And in that report, it concluded that the NCP, and I'm quoting from the UN Working Group report, the NCP was perceived by stakeholders as potentially not fully independent, given that it was housed within a ministry that was responsible for promoting overseas trade and investment. Stakeholders also noted that the National Contact Point had no external advisory or oversight body. It was highlighted to the working group that the lack of confidence of civil society in the National Contact Point was apparent, which might have limited the numbers of cases brought before it. And in the 2019 peer review report on Canada's NCP, the NCP peers found that, and I'm quoting, the NCP has been making various efforts to respond to learnings and improve its functioning in recent years. Despite these efforts, there is a lack of confidence and trust in the NCP among some civil society and trade union stakeholders. Rebuilding this trust and ensuring continued coherence on RBC across the Government of Canada will be central to ensuring the effectiveness of the NCP going forward. The peer review process also made a pretty basic recommendation that the Canadian NCP include civil society as what they call a social partner, along with the social partners it has long had, which represent the business community and labor. The NCP has not yet responded to this simple recommendation. I want to conclude by spending a bit more time on a signature case that really exemplifies the ongoing problems with our NCP, and most egregious among these, from my point of view, the way the NCP's industry bias and inequitable process actually deepens harm to complainants and to the efforts of communities and victims of Canadian companies to prevent or remedy the harm that they endure. So this is the case that was brought as a substantiated submission complaint to the OECD Investment Committee. So this is a complaint against an NCP, and there's only been 2 brought, and this is the second one. So this is not a mining case, but MiningWatch Canada was deeply involved in this case because of the larger issues that it was bringing forward, which were issues that we had also been concerned about for a very long time. So in 2016, the Bruno Munzer Fund, which is an NGO based in Switzerland, filed a complaint regarding lack of financial transparency with the Canadian NCP against an Ottawa-based group called Sacto Group. So this group was based in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. This is a real estate and investment holding company with close ties to the family of the Sarawak governor and former chief minister Abdul Taib Mahmood from Malaysia. And the principals of the Sacto Group also have strong political ties in Ottawa, where they're based. In October of 2016, the Canadian NCP produced a detailed draft initial assessment in which it proposed to accept the case for good offices, finding the issues material and substantiated and meriting further examination. Bruno Munzer Fund, BMF, gave its approval of the initial assessment and agreed to participate in the NCP's good offices. By the way, good offices means, as I think Katharine has already mentioned, that the NCP will offer mediation between the disputing parties. However, after providing that draft initial assessment, the NCP became unresponsive to BMF for many months. Finally, the NCP notified both parties in March of 2017 that it intended to close the case without providing any reasons. Shortly after that, BMF went public with the case for the first time. In July of 2017, without consulting BMF, the NCP published a final statement that placed blame for closing the case on both BMF for allegedly breaching confidentiality and on the Sacto Group. The statement revealed what BMF had predicted as it complained of, and I'm quoting, Sacto involving a member of parliament during the confidential NCP assessment process, Sacto's aggressive challenge of the NCP's jurisdiction, Sacto's legal counsel making submissions to the government of Canada's Deputy Minister of Justice, unquote. 10 months after the July 2017 final statement that I've just quoted from was made public on the NCP's website, on the 11th of May 2018, so almost a year later, without consultation or notification of BMF, the Canadian NCP removed the first published final statement and replaced it with a new one. The May 2018 final statement removes all mention of the breach of confidentiality and the pressure exerted on the NCP by Sacto and its lawyers and political allies, but does mention what the NCP calls a breach of confidentiality by BMF, and implies that this was the sole reason for rejecting the complaint. The OECD Investment Committee reviewed this concern that we raised with them and found that the Canadian government's handling of the Sacto complaint, and I'm just going to give you the bullets, lacked transparency and limited its own accountability, was not fully equitable, contributed towards a perception of lack of impartiality, lacked predictability, was not fully compatible with the procedural guidance set by the OECD Investment Committee. And the response also took seriously OECD Watch's concern that Canada's biased handling of the Sacto complaint may have resulted in harm to the Bruno Munzer funds. The committee recommended that the Canadian government address this concern by following up with the parties and taking, and I'm quoting, any appropriate measure within its mandate to mitigate the adverse effects, if any, of this specific instance. In other words, complaint. To date, the Canadian NCP has not communicated with Bruno Munzer Fund, nor has it changed its final statement on the case of May 2018 to remove its blatant bias against Bruno Munzer Fund. Clearly, this case exemplifies how engaging the Canadian NCP can harm a complainant, but it is not the only such case. In MiningWatch's engagement with the NCP over 7 cases, we repeatedly noticed how complainants would have been better off not having brought a case at all, as the NCP's dismissal of most cases was widely interpreted, for example, by the media or by socially responsible investors, as evidence that there was no substance to the complaint itself. This interpretation was enhanced by the way the NCP would draft the final statements in such a way that made it appear as if it had investigated the case and come to a conclusion of fact leading to its dismissal, when in fact the NCP does not independently investigate cases, and is very explicit that it does not make statements of fact about whether the guidelines have been breached. There are other ways in which participants in the NCP process has proven to be harmful to many complainants, but I'll leave it at this for now, and I'm happy to expand on this question in the question period. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. That was very helpful. After these 3 presentations, I mean, you raise a lot of important issues, and let me try to ask you a couple of questions that will incorporate the question we have in the Q&A, but also give you an opportunity to respond to each other. Clearly, we're dealing with a flawed mechanism. Katharine Booth began by identifying some strengths and some weaknesses, but obviously the weaknesses are part of the flaws of the process. The question for all of you then is it a completely failed process, a completely failed mechanism that's not worth engaging with? Obviously, MiningWatch Canada has decided not to engage with its NCP. Or are there differences, for instance, in the NCPs? Obviously, there may be other NCPs that are better in terms of the threshold of bringing complaints in, or the process itself, or maybe they're not as compromised in terms of the composition of the NCP. But also the question from the Q&A, are there different elements within the process itself that could be improved, such as making the mechanism binding, which seems like a pretty tall order, but let's put it out there on the table and see if that's a possibility for, say, the next set of revisions to the OECD guidelines on this issue. On the other hand, perhaps this isn't worthwhile to engage in. If so, what other options are there? What other global mechanisms, international mechanisms are available to bring complaints like this? They could be legal, they could be non-legal. I'm throwing that out there as a question. The second question, that was a long first question. The second question is, do these new guidelines change things fundamentally? I'm interested in hearing what Katharine Coumans thinks about this. Will the new guidelines lead to a rethinking by MiningWatch Canada of this process? Is there something hopeful in there? And then the third question is about the Lynas case. And Litan is interested in hearing about the prospects of bringing it to the OECD mechanism. But of course, that's going to depend on a number of things, one of which obviously is the NCP in Malaysia itself, whether folks can weigh in on that if you know about that. And two, of course, the details of the case itself. So I'm going to go first to Katharine Booth and to hear her thoughts, and then maybe come back to Katharine Coumans, and then finally to Lee Tan for her comments.
Thanks, John. Is it completely flawed? Well, some NGOs would say yes, but in OECD Watch's view, it's not completely flawed. There's absolutely flaws, but in some case, I've said it's the last resort, but in some case, the last resort is the first resort. There often is nothing else to file a complaint to at the national, regional or international level. So it is the first and the last option. It is the only option. Yeah, that's the first point. I mentioned in my presentation that some NCPs are stronger than others. OECD Watch has NCP evaluations, and on our website you can see essentially which NCPs are stronger or more effective than other NCPs. In OECD Watch's view, an effective NCP will have certain features to it. Katharine mentioned lack of independence from certain trade bodies in the government as being an example of a more effective NCP. OECD Watch agrees. A more effective NCP will, in OECD Watch's view, also be more likely to make determinations. They will have a lower determinations, just to repeat, is a decision of compliance or non-compliance with the guidelines, which are increasingly common and really strong. More effective NCPs will have a lower threshold, will provide for more encompassing mediation. They'll do many sort of things that are more inclusive for all the parties to be involved. They themselves have more expertise. They're stronger. To be honest, they're often wealthier as well. They have more money to throw at this mechanism. NCPs are severely underfunded, and the OECD recognized that underfunding of NCPs and shortage of staff turnover was recognized in the guidelines as a big problem. So the flaws are recognized, but in some cases it's the only option. Often when a complaint is also combined, OECD Watch always recommends complaints to be combined as part of a broader advocacy strategy, because there are so many flaws with NCPs. More often than not, the case will fail. So the complaint should not rest on its own. An NGO filing a complaint should also be targeting the media. Maybe there's a separate complaint that's been filed that is not related to the guidelines. So, you know, we're sort of attacking a company we're targeting a company on multiple levels. So we see that more effective complaints, or complaints more likely to achieve some outcome, and not just filed alone to an NCP, because that often is unsuccessful. Just briefly, other options. If you don't file to an NCP, there are complaint mechanisms to development banks, for example, if the harm is caused by a development bank, but that isn't that common in the end. There are increasingly legislative initiatives, legislation. The French, the German supply chain law, Australia and the UK have modern slavery legislation, although they are quite limited. The EU, obviously the EU is, I'm sure we're all aware, is going to hopefully introduce a due diligence law this or next year. And that will be extraterritorial, that will extend beyond the EU's borders, and it will hopefully provide some sort of enforcement mechanism for companies that fail to conduct adequate due diligence. But while the scope is really broad, there will still be gaps. There are always gaps, and the NCPs can often fill that gap. And then, just as a last point, I'll be quick. Does the updated text of the guidelines actually change anything? OECD Watch says yes, in terms of the standards for companies. The standards really have been strengthened in terms of, particularly in terms of climate and environment. But there are other things, for example, like animal welfare has been included. You know, there's different ways of like framing a company's responsibility now in 2023, and the OECD has a good job to update the guidelines. But OECD Watch's biggest concern about the guidelines is that they didn't sufficiently strengthen the expectations for NCPs. So while the standards for companies have been really strengthened, the expectations for NCPs haven't sufficiently, in our view. Many expectations remain. We had pushed for requirements, NCPs to must make a determination. NCPs must do this, but that really hasn't been put into the guidelines. The language is NCPs should, or it is an option to make a determination. So in our view, that is one of the biggest failings of the guidelines, because in the end, as I mentioned in my presentation, NCPs have two mandates. One is promotion, they promote the guidelines, and one is complaint handling. And they can promote the new standards to companies that are really good, but in the end, if NCPs aren't strong enough, aren't effective enough to actually handle an NCP complaint and encourage the party, facilitate an agreement between the parties, then the NCP mechanism sort of doesn't stand if they are not strong enough to implement their complaint handling mandate. And that is a big concern of OECD Watch. I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. We'll go back to you about your evaluation of the Lynas case after Katharine Coumans and Lee Tan have had an opportunity to chat. Katharine, other Katharine?
Yes, well, Katharine Booth's answer to the question, I think, helps me a lot. I think we do participate in every review process of the Canadian NCP. And what we do in that review process primarily is to point to those NCPs that are doing a better job. So there are definitely NCPs out there that are doing a better job. There are NCPs who do actual investigations, sometimes even bring in an independent body to do the investigation. There's NCPs that are very much removed from political interference, or much more removed because they're not under a trade agency or run by the trade officer. There's NCPs that do make determinations of fact that say this, yes, this company has breached the guidelines. So there's definitely models out there. There's not that many, but there are models out there. And so whenever we review our Canadian NCP, we point to all of those models. But there's a really tough resistance from our NCP to join those models, and even to do something as simple as have a social partner from civil society, which is a pretty basic ask. So I do think there's possibilities for these mechanisms to be stronger, and I think there's models out there. I also think it's important for there to be a non-judicial option for people. It's not only because it's the only place you can go or there is no other option, but even people who are fortunate enough to be able to bring a legal case, maybe even in the home country of the corporation that has harmed them. Not everyone wants to bring a legal case. There should be a strong non-judicial mechanism or option, and this could be it. It's just not right now. Well, particularly in Canada. I should speak only for Canada because that's the one I'm really familiar with, and I know there's better options out there. In terms of other options for extraterritorial issues, I think Katharine's already mentioned the complaints mechanisms with banks. There's other types of complaints mechanisms within international bodies. I think the mandatory human rights due diligence directives that are coming out, Katharine mentioned France and Germany. We in Canada have legislation on the books now. We have a private members bill that has brought legislation that would require companies, Canadian-based companies, to carry out human rights due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence, and would also, and this is very important, provide access to our courts for people who've been harmed by Canadian-based companies operating overseas. So these due diligence mechanisms that are being talked about are not just mechanisms, they're legislation, they're mandatory for companies, and they provide access to legal remedies, which is now, it's very, very difficult to bring a case in Canada against a mining company that has harmed people overseas. There are a number of test cases in Canada, and they are growing, which is encouraging, but it's still a situation where you have many, many hurdles to get over. Whereas I can go into the details if people want that, but some of those hurdles would be wiped away by this legislation. The issue of whether the improved guidelines will help us with the situation we have here in Canada, I'm always really pleased when I see stronger standards coming out in something like the OECD guidelines, because the OECD guidelines have very strong status as guidelines. And so they get incorporated into a lot of other guidelines or even mandatory requirements that come up. So in our mandatory legislation, our private members bill in Canada, the OECD guidelines are one of the standards that are referred to for what companies need to live up to when they do their due diligence. So right now they're not doing that, or they're not doing it in a mandated way. But if they were, the OECD guidelines would be one of the places that they should look to see how they do their due diligence. And so the stronger the standards are, the better. But again, the problem is actually not the standards. We could keep bringing cases against Canadian mining companies, even based on the old standards. Definitely under the new standards, but even under the old ones, it was never the problem that the standards weren't strong enough. For us, always the problem was the NCP and the NCP's inequitable process. The final thing on the issue of campaigning, of using the NCP process as part of a wider campaigning effort, I just have to say that there's a real problem here because of the issue of confidentiality. So this came up in the Sacto case. So the Bruno Munzer Fund from Switzerland that brought the case in Canada was also entangled with the Sacto group in legal action. But when they got involved with the NCP, they had to make all kinds of agreements to confidentiality. And I think Katharine can maybe describe a little bit more just how far that should go, but it goes quite far. And so when the NCP first said that they were going to allow the case to go forward for good offices, and then flipped and just put out a very bland draft final statement saying, nope, we're not going to let this go ahead. At that point, Bruno Munzer Fund felt it was okay for them to go public because the case was going to be dismissed. And they went public, and they have been slammed for that over and over again. Everything that Sacto did, bringing in the Canadian Member of Parliament, going to the Department of Justice in Canada, bringing in their lawyers to slam the NCP. And all of that was also breaching confidentiality, where they went outside of the process. That is not in the final statement that is still on the books in Canada. All that's on the final statement is that the Bruno Munzer Fund breached confidentiality. And that has actually been brought up in the legal case that they've got against the Sacto group. So the Sacto group has used the NCP complaint mechanism in the legal case to say, look, it got thrown out in Canada. You see, these people have no grounds to stand on. Plus, you can't trust them. They breached confidentiality. It actually deeply harmed them in their legal case. So, if you want to campaign on an issue, you have to be sure that you can campaign, and you won't be restricted in your campaigning by confidentiality agreements that you've signed with the NCP. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharine. We have another question that came up in the Q&A on the issue of governance and undermining democracy, and especially in the Global South. But I want to first turn to Lee. You've heard these, presentations on the OECD guidelines, the update, as well as the experience in Canada. I'm curious to hear your response. Is it changing at all your kind of thinking about your case, Lynas case, and approaching the OECD? And then after you do that, we're going to go back to the two Katharines and get their thoughts on your case as well, specifically.
Yes, certainly. If and when OECD Watch put in the complaint, we won't do it alone. We probably will be contacting other NGOs that are watching the NCP Australia. In our case, we will have to lodge the complaint with the Australian NCP because Lynas is listed with the Australian Stock Exchange. And also Malaysia is not an OECD country, so there isn't an NCP in Malaysia. It is always a very difficult one. If you don't lodge a complaint, there's no real mechanism apart from lobbying politicians. Maybe we are working with Friends of the Earth eventually on this campaign. And we might we will still pursue that avenue. The NCP, again, it's more for the test case. Interestingly, years ago, when we went to Canberra, we met with the NCP people, which sits with the Treasury Department in Australia. They actually wanted us to lodge a complaint. Yeah, I mean, maybe because they just want to justify their existence. Yeah, I guess we will be very careful, and we will definitely partner, hopefully, with other groups that has got a lot of experience dealing with the NCP and not going alone, so that we will not be crucified, if you like, by the NCP. There is a change of government in Australia. The previous government is highly pro-mining. The current government is slightly better, but it's also pro-mining. So we're not overly optimistic, but it is one mechanism that we can try. And, we will do that because we do have the evidence. Again, we will have to be very strategic about it, capturing all the lessons learned from Canada and also from EU. Yeah, and I also like to ask, with OECD Watch, are there any support for groups, trying to use the OECD guidelines to lodge complaint?
Thank you, Lee. Yes, Katharine Booth, I think that's something you can answer. And as you answer, we're coming to the last 10 minutes of our session. So I want to make sure that you A, answer that question, B, maybe both you and the other Katharine can give maybe some suggestions to Lee as she's thinking about preparing this case, whatever you might know about the Australian NCP. And then finally, this last question about governance and whether this issue of governance and the undermining of democracy can be raised. And if you have time, I'm curious, well, who are the people who staff the NCPs? Are these, former lawyers, former judges, former mining corporation executives? I mean, who are these people and how do they get to that position? And is there any democratic oversight in this process that the average citizen can engage with?
I will try to answer all those questions. I'll start with the support for groups. So yes, well, first of all, OECD Watch supports communities and NGOs who are potentially filing complaints. So OECD Watch provides general and sometimes specific advice on the complaint idea before the actual filing is made, but also we can provide more specific advice once the complaint has been filed. I think it's a good idea that you're collaborating with other NGOs which have other experiences, not more experience, but they have Friends of the Earth, environment, maybe also a more like an NGO that has filed specifically to the Australian NCP. So I think that's really good because often successful complaints will be filed as part of a strategy, as I said, but the strategy also means expertise. So the people sitting in the room have expertise in the issues that were raised in the complaint, but also expertise in how NCPs actually work. I'm just looking at my notes, so my answers will be all over the place. Who staffs NCPs? It varies based on the NCP. Just for everyone's knowledge, the second substantiated submission by OECD Watch was filed with Katharine Coumans, MiningWatch, to NCP Canada, but the first was filed against NCP Australia. And Australia significantly reformed their NCP and have, in OECD Watch's view, good reforms were made, strong reforms were made. I would consider now Australia as a strong NCP. The people that staff that NCP are, I think, consultants, for example. I think in their spare time, they are also barristers. They I mentioned the turnover in NCPs. This is an example of turnover. Like everything, it's a temp job, I guess. It's a consulting job. So they'll sort of hire people with legal expertise in Australia. In the Netherlands, it's a different structure. It's a more effective structure, which has this independent level like the Australian. So the actual people in the room in the NCP are representatives from the three society groups. So there's an NGO rep, a trade union rep, there's an academic background, someone with more of a business background, I think. And they're sort of like external experts that are the people that are actually dealing with the case. But I think that most NCPs are staffed by bureaucrats, and there is no, to answer John's question, there is no civilian oversight. The government, the department makes a decision about who staffs an NCP, and then by all accounts, they change their mind, with every change of government. So every 4 years, I think there's, new people staffing the NCP. So that's an idea, but Lee, the Australian NCP I consider to be quite strong. If I think about your case, the first biggest point I would make is it's tricky at the moment because we're in a transition period from the 2011 version, the previous version of the guidelines, to the current 2023 version of the guidelines. So in the same way that you can't retroactively apply a law, you cannot say 10 years ago this company did something, but the 2023 guidelines apply. It's a weird period. So many complaints, potentially yours, might be filed under the previous version, but that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that you can't draw on what is said and the standards for companies in your complaint. You can still say
the harm is still happening now, though.
Yeah, exactly.
It started in
Exactly.
2011, but the harm's continuing today still.
Yeah. So especially once this transition period is over, the complaints can be made under 2023 version of the guidelines. Once companies have had a chance to learn about the update, which hopefully they are doing now, think about it, respond to it, see that they have responsibilities to do with the Paris Agreement, just transition. I think that period will be perhaps 6 to 12 months, but it's a good idea to start engaging with the company on the new updated guidelines, because that's the sort of evidence you need to show to inform the company that these guidelines exist and they should meet the standards in the guidelines. Your complaint would have environmental impacts, human rights impacts. Also, you mentioned disclosure is also a standard. There's a whole chapter on disclosure. You also mentioned greenwashing, and that is addressed in the guidelines as well. Just a second. Yes, I agree that you should pursue the cases in Malaysia first because they seem to have some strong potential, but also because while complaints shouldn't be rejected solely on the basis of ongoing parallel proceedings, ongoing other proceedings, often NCPs will feel hesitant to accept a case if there are other ongoing proceedings. So I do think, based on what you've said, that to pursue the cases in Malaysia first is a good idea. Also because we're in this transition period with the 2023 guidelines. I will stop talking.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're running down to our last couple of minutes. I want to give Katharine Coumans a chance to say any final words, and then Lee also, if you have any final words.
Well, maybe just to Lee. I mean, it's certainly interesting to hear that the substantiated submission complaint against Australia, which was the first, and then Canada was the second, actually led to a strengthening of the NCP. I wish the same could be said for Canada. But in that case, it may be quite a good place to go. And what I would suggest, not knowing enough about the details of your NCP, what I would suggest is having that conversation, going to them and asking them very specific questions. And some of the questions I would ask is, they will have their guidelines posted somewhere. So, you can review those first of all. But I would just talk to them about confidentiality, say that this is a really horrible issue, that people are being harmed as we speak, that people need to be able to campaign to protect themselves, and what kind of restrictions would confidentiality put on you, your group and others that might get involved, would you then not be as effective in the campaigning? And ask them, do they do independent investigations? Would they talk to you about hiring a group to actually do an independent report on the issues that you're bringing? And would they make a statement of fact? Would they actually come out and say, yes, the guidelines were breached? And I would also talk to them about protection against bias. And maybe that won't be as much of an issue for you. For us, it's a huge issue because of the way our NCP is housed within government. All of the NCP participants are from government. They're civil servants. And as I said, the lead is actually the Trade Department, which is really problematic. So yeah, I would have that conversation, and you could start having that at any time, right? Because that will help you make the decision about whether the risks and the rewards, how to balance the risks and the rewards. Because I just think it's really important for people to understand there are risks. They're really real, very real risks. Yeah, and even to your campaign, right? Because your campaign is around how the media perceives the issue. It's how socially responsible investors or others who can put pressure on the company perceive the issue. And if the NCP throws it out with a really awful final statement, that can undermine your credibility with all the others that you're working with, right? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That absolutely. I really appreciate the feedback from both of you. Because so far our campaign's been mostly on media initially, public protests in Malaysia for about 5 to 6 years, and of more recent years we've been mainly engaging in EIA processes, legal actions in Malaysia, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it is good to consider all of the issues, particularly the confidentiality and also the lack of independent investigation. I think that those are issues that needs to be considered before we proceed. And your suggestion to engage with the NCP and also the company, writing the company, reminding them of the OECD guidelines, particularly when this company is really trying to make it big, selling to to the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese. All of them are OECD countries, and they all kind of being given this impression that Lynas rare earth is actually mined and processed in ecologically sustainable manner that's also respecting human rights and so on and so forth. So yeah, those are really, really important. I'm really, really grateful for the information so far. And thank you all for that. And John as well for getting this together. Yeah.
Well, Lee, you have stolen my words. I too am very grateful for all these presentations, and it has been extremely helpful. I hope that other folks who've been listening and will listen when we release this video more broadly will find it useful. The case study, the general identification of the principles and the changing guidelines, as well as the experience in Canada with the specific NCP that you've been struggling with. And let's hope that you eventually have an Australian type transformation that takes place there in Canada as well. We'll follow up with everybody who has participated in this as audience members with a link to the video, and I'll be following up with all of you as presenters as we prepare an article on this important topic. Once again, thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events over the summer and into the fall.